So I'm Professor Marc-André Léger from the John Molson School of Business, and this video is recorded for the course BTM 440, which is about the Business System Information Risk Management. And so in today's video, what I want to show you is how to perform a risk assessment using COBIT 5 for risk and a spreadsheet that I've created for this purpose. So just so you know, we will be using the methodology that is described in something that I published a few years ago, which is called Using COBIT 5 for Risk. So you can find this on our Moodle site, and it's also available online, so it's pretty easy. And so we will be using risk scenarios, and we have basically two approaches for that. So I just want to show you first the bottom-up approach. So in this strategy, what we're doing is we're going to be using generic risk scenarios that are included in COBIT 5. And as you can see, there's a whole bunch of them here that we can be using. And so again, those you can find those by online. And you can also find information about those on our Moodle site as well, because this is an ISACA program, and we've included in the program a whole bunch of different scenarios for you. And a top-down approach where we're going to actually use risk management scenarios, risk scenarios that are coming from our business goals in the organization. And here I want to show you a real-life example. And this is one from a project that I did a few years ago, as you can see, in 2009. Now, as you know, I do most of my consulting activities, or I used to anyway, in French in the Quebec healthcare sector. So this is a real example from there. And the methodology to do that is the same one described in the publication I mentioned earlier, just that here it's in French. So we're describing the scenario, giving it a name, describing who are the stakeholders, what's the scenario about, and then we're evaluating this scenario. So all the different elements that we'll be talking about here, we're using a sliding scale from 0 to 1. Again, I'll talk about that later, but just so you have an idea of how this works. And when we do this in an organizational setting, we're doing sort of like a brainstorming session with the different stakeholders, and we're building a consensus on what people can agree on. So typically I would put this up on the large version of these diagrams. I would put them up on the whiteboard or on the wall, and then we'd have discussions about the probabilities and impacts and all these different elements that we'll be including in the scenario. So this is what a top-down approach looks like. So just so you know what it is that we'll be talking about when we start doing this scenario. So this is the spreadsheet that you have access to on Moodle. And so this is the spreadsheet that I use for risk evaluation. As you can see, in this first version, everything is sort of empty. And so we're starting with that as a generic approach. So let's say that I'm just going to use some of the COBIT scenarios to start. So I'm just going to choose a couple examples here. And I'm going to use one of the risk scenarios from COBIT, just copying it and paste it from the one I had before. So this is a COBIT 5 generic scenario 0101. Ooh, got the 5 wrong here. So this is COBIT. So this, as I'm going down, I'm going to be indicating the source. So all the different things that I'm going to be using, as you can see, they're identified here at the bottom, what the meaning of them. So the first one here, this is the probability that the threat will be present. So here is this a very low probability. I should read what it is that we're doing. So this one is wrong programs are selected for implementation and are misaligned with the company strategies and probabilities. So as you can see, the values down here I give you some indicators of of values that you could be using. So average is 0.5. In this case, we'll say that the probability of this is 0.5. Do note that I have a comma instead of a period. It's just because my Excel here is set up for French Canadian, so it might be a little bit different. And the next one is this one here. So this is the probability of the presence of the vulnerability, and this we will say it's a certainty, so we're going to leave it at 1. Vulnerability, there is a vulnerability present that this can take advantage of. The next one, so we'll go down here, look at the symbol here. So the probability that the vulnerability will be exploited. In this case, let's say that the probability is going to be average. Again, this is going to be coming out of the consensus of the organization. The next one, so what are the estimated expected damages if this actually materializes? So let's say that in this case they are average. What is the next one? What are the maximum damages that can be expected? Let's say that in this case they would be very high. And then the next one, what is the level of organizational resilience that we have as an organization? Perhaps as it refers to this scenario, or it could be a more general if I don't have an estimate here. And then finally, the last one, what is the expected utility of the assets that are involved in this scenario? Let's say that in this case they are average. So here we go. So now we've calculated our key risk indicator, and so I do want to point out to you that this is used as a decision-making tool in organizations, as we've discussed in class. So this is not, we're not coming up with a dollar value of the risk, or we're really looking for an indicator. And as we complete the different scenarios, and I suggest that in this case we're going to be just doing 10. In the real world setting, we wouldn't want to do more than 20. More than that we'd be wasting our time. Because it becomes too difficult to really operationalize and actually get some meaningful management decisions to be made out of this. Now, as the level of maturity will grow, as we become better and better at doing this, we will be able to increase the number of scenarios. But if you're doing this in an organizational setting for the first time, 10 is a good number to start. 20 should be your maximum. For us in the pedagogical context, in doing this in class, and for most of you, I'm guessing it's probably the first time that you've ever done this, we're going to limit ourselves at 10. And rather than creating our own scenarios, what I propose is that we start with some ready-made scenarios. And so what I've done really to show you an example is I've actually completed a whole bunch of different scenarios using some examples and things that I've done in the past in other contexts, and perhaps with students as well. And so I've identified them here. I made sure that they were based on real experience, but also wouldn't divulge any confidential information from any of my customers or people I've done this with in a professional context. And so as you see here, so we've done all the data on the same model of what I've just showed you. Now here we have a conditional field where so the data here indicates being a red. So in red, this means that in this case, the estimated risk is higher than the tolerated risk. So this is what this is telling us here. In this example that we have. And so as I complete this with the organization, and I validate with the different stakeholders that they're comfortable with the numbers that I've put here in evaluating what the risk is, then I'm going to move on to the next step. So in the next step, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be looking at mitigation measures. And so this is what this part here is. The second part is the mitigation measures. So here I'm going to go show you. I've actually based on ISO 27002, because in this organization what we've done is that we've determined that we would be using ISO 27002 as a management framework to help us to determine what are the controls that we should be putting in place. And ISO 27002 is something that we've discussed in class, so this shouldn't come as a big surprise to you what this is. So we've estimated using these different controls in our organizational settings, and we've identified what the control is. As you see, this is the list of the ISO 27002 2013 controls. So we've properly identified the source as being that. Then we've estimated what would be the CapEx, capital expenditure cost for doing this, the software cost, the implementation cost. How much would it cost us on a yearly basis to exploit this? What would be the human resources required? We calculated that in FTEs, or full-time equivalencies. So there'd be a person in this one example here that we have here, 0.02 of the yearly task of an individual in our information security group would be in charge of this process, which is in this case review of the policies for information security. The effectiveness of this, the effectiveness and the efficiency. So how good is it at helping us to achieve our goals, and what's the probability that this is actually going to be working? So we're doing that, and we've actually over the years, perhaps in an organizational setting, we've determined what those would be, what would be the effectiveness of those controls. So we've put them there. So we've maintained this table so that make our life easier. And here what we're doing is we're looking at, for each of these scenarios, what would be the controls that we would use? What would be the components, the things that we would be doing in order to reduce the risks associated with this scenario? So this is what we're showing in this table here. So like I said, you have access to this, so you can go and look at that, of the details of how this works. But this is showing us the efficiency. So now that we know, we've seen this, now we can understand this part here of the spreadsheet, where we're looking at, okay, what are the different packages that we've in mitigation measures that we've identified that would correspond to each of these scenarios, and what would be their impact on the risk. So here we're seeing the residual risk. So what would be really the effect of these mitigation measures, and what would be the residual risk once we've applied that? And so that's what this section here is about, helping us to understand what would be the effect of this. And here again, we've still identified that there's 3 that are showing in red, and those 3 are such that even once we've done what we propose to do for risk management, we would still, for risk mitigation, we would still have a residual risk that is higher than the tolerated risk, which is the column V here, right? So these would still be problematic. But then we need to ask ourselves the questions, okay, are we willing to accept that? That's an organizational decision. That's not something that's going to show here. Like I said at the beginning, this is a decision-making tool. This is a tool for managers to help them make decisions. And so in the end, how much risk we're willing to take is going to be a decision of the organization. My job as the risk analyst here is to assess the risk, to give managers tools, to give them data, to be able to make a better decision. And so that's what we're talking about here. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be building a portfolio, so a risk management portfolio based on these different things that I've proposed. And so, for example, I'm proposing 4, where D is always everything. Let's say if I did everything, then this would cost 1.5 mil, and it would have an efficiency of about 45%. And I would still end up with a residual risk of 157 if I did everything, if I took all of these scenarios under consideration in my decision-making process. So I'd be spending 1.5 million. If I did only the highest, this is column A here, or X in here, but A in my example. If I'm doing only the minimum, let me make this a little bit bigger and move it over here. Okay, only the highest one. So these are the ones in red here. I'd be spending 450,000. I'd be doing pretty well because I'm really, affecting what are only my highest ones. And then so I have, what if I did the strict minimum? So these are just the ones that are the highest overall. And then what if I made a recommendation of, based on my experience, based on, as I've been doing many of these before, and my recommendation to the organization, knowing that, their budget based on their total IT expenditures and their appetite for risk being, average at 0.5. So they're willing to take some risk, but not too much. So they're relatively moderately conservative. And in this case, this would mean that about 10% of their global IT budget, actually around 8% of their global IT budget. So typically we're between 4 to 12. So if I have a very high risk appetite, I'd be spending about 4. If I have a very low risk appetite, or I'm very risk averse, I should be spending about 12% of my total IT budget on risk management. So in this case, the average being about 8. And I know that in the organization that I have here, that 8% figure is about $800,000. And so I've put together a recommendation based on which ones I think that should be handled. And that's what I'm putting here in column C. And this is my recommendation to management of what they should be doing, in my opinion, would be a good choice for them to be doing. In the end, of course, it's not going to be my decision. It's going to be management decision. And I'm obviously going to be very happy and with the decision that they make, because it's their decision to make. And so they may choose something else. They may ask me to revise some of the scenarios. They might say, okay, well, this one, for other reasons, we're very, very concerned about this scenario. And so let's look at how we could perhaps spend a little bit more money on risk mitigation on this scenario and rethink that. I mean, this is really, as I said, a decision-making tool. And it's going to be used for discussions. There's going to be quite a few discussions happening over time on how we're going to do that. So as I've said at the beginning, so this is the Excel spreadsheet that you have access to and that you can use. And you're more than welcome to make a copy of it and use it if in the future. We'll be using this, of course, as part of our different assignments or some of the assignments and labs that we could be doing in this course. And so this is a good example of a relatively straightforward way that you can do risk assessments in an organizational context. So again, I'm Professor Marc-André Léger, and this is the John Molson School of Business BTM 440 course on IT risk management. So basically information security risk management. And I've showed you the methodology that I've been using for COBIT 5 for risk to do a risk assessment.